So this is screencast one for the session on food poverty and food insecurity. I just want you to start by spending a few moments thinking, how does food poverty of the UK population affect your dietetic practice? So maybe pause the video for a moment and just stop and think and make some notes. How does it impact on your dietetic practice? What does that mean for us working as dietitians and how we should work? So it's important for us to think about the terminology that we use and how that might relate to these particular subjects, because there's a lot of related terminology, but doesn't always mean the same thing. So when we think of hunger, you and I might think, I'm hungry, it's tea time. But for a lot of people in the world, of course, this is a much more severe issue, and therefore it becomes a distressing situation associated with a lack of sufficient energy, calories. So for you and me, it might mean I'm really hungry, but for many people in the world, and including in the UK, it might be literally that painful sensation caused by a lack of food. So much more severe than most of us experience. Malnutrition, you'll be very familiar with already. So it could be lack of nutrition, inadequate nutrition, not enough. It could be unbalanced, or it could be excessive, as in the case of people living with overweight or obesity, or perhaps too much of a micronutrient as well. So malnutrition is quite a broad term. And both of these are likely to be associated with an insecure food supply. And we'll come back to that later. Undernutrition. So undernourishment, not enough energy, protein, vitamins and minerals. But it could also be exacerbated by poor absorption or nutrients that have got poor bioavailability or the body isn't able to use for some reason. So undernutrition can happen for a variety of reasons. So these are linked terms, but not the same thing. So nutrition security is seen as a situation where secure access to an appropriately nutritious diet, which of course is not going to be the same for everybody, is coupled with a sanitary environment, so food storage, for cooking, for eating, adequate health services and care to ensure a healthy and active lifestyle for all household members. So to me, this is a bit broader than nutrition. But this is seen where, the focus here is on the nutritious diet. And food insecurity also is seen as not something that necessarily causes hunger, but hunger is a possible outcome. So we'll go on and look at some more definitions to try and help us understand that a little bit more. So food poverty, what does that mean? So this could affect an individual or a household or a whole community, but they aren't able to obtain healthy, nutritious food or can't access it of the food that they would like to eat. So we're looking at availability, people being able to afford it being accessible to them. So in the UK, we have huge choice about food, and many foods are highly available and affordable, and many people still can't eat what they would like. They eat what they can afford. So that's an interesting definition, I think, getting you to think it's about people eating what they can afford rather than they want. And I guess there's an aspect for most of us where we don't always choose a really expensive food. But we're talking here of a situation where people consistently cannot eat what they would like. They eat what they can afford. So what about food insecurity? So let's start by thinking about what food security is. So we're looking at what makes a secure food supply. And it's when this is the FAO, you can notice this is 20 years old, more than that. And it's still used um, still used quite widely in the literature. And this is because what we were trying to aim for, or what the FAO were trying to aim for, was a situation where all people, and when they meant all, this is a worldwide organization, all people at all times have physical, so it's there, and economic, they can afford it, to safe, nutritious food, sufficient, safe, and nutritious food that's meeting their dietary needs and their food preferences. So this is what people are culturally comfortable with eating, and what their faith preferences and likes and dislikes to a certain extent. So everybody should have that choice of food that's going to feed them nutritionally and also feed them from a psychological and psychosocial aspect of it. So quite a wide definition and a great idea if we could actually achieve that. So this helps us to think about what food insecurity is. So if we take that definition and unpack it a little bit in relation to what it actually means. So when we're looking here, the first one is about stability of the food supply and the food system. So there may be times when the food supply is interrupted. So we might think, for example, of the dreadful situations in Morocco and Libya recently, where part of the infrastructure has been destroyed by an earthquake or floods. So the supply, the stability of the food supply, getting to all of the people affected is disturbed at this moment. So people living in food insecurity don't have stability in their food supply. So it could be a supply that is interrupted. So also in conflict situations. So there are parts of the Ukraine, for example, where there may be difficulty and stability of that food supply. So the next thing to think about is affordability and availability. So is that food actually or potentially present? Is it available? So this thinks about, has it been produced? Has there been a good harvest or a bad harvest? What are the stock levels? What are the costs? Have there been any problems with trade? So that has the supply changed? So is it actually available to us? The third aspect to consider is access. So this is about whether the individual can get that food that is available. So is it accessible to them? So it might be that you have an elderly person who can't drive in a rural area where the local shops have all closed and there's only an out-of-town supermarket, which requires a car to get to. So the access to food is influenced by that. So that individual may not be able to access things because of income, because of lack of shops, because of lack of transport, and potentially lack of the ability to access the internet and make a food order like you might do. So the access can be affected by all of those things. And finally, we have the idea about utilization. So whether the food is maximized for its nutritional value. So that might be people ability to cook food and prepare it, but also it might be about something physically about that individual. They may have some gut problems, they may have malabsorption, so they can't get that food to where it needs to be in their body. So there are obviously various illnesses that affect that. Celiac, undiagnosed celiac disease will affect people's ability to absorb iron and calcium. So we know that they are more at risk of iron deficiency anemia and osteoporosis. So there's other things, of course, but all of those things act to influence the ability for someone to utilize foods. So these are the dimensions of food security. And the opposite of those, of course, makes an insecure food supply. So in Screencast 2, we will have a look at what makes people vulnerable as either individuals or populations.